Okay, everyone. Again, welcome back to Capstone Presentations. We're going to continue now with our panel. Hold on, where's my panel title? On religion and science in colonial Latin America. Sorry, guys, I had it up. And our first presenter is going to be none other than Ms. Hyland Gonzalez herself. And here it is. The title of our panel is Medicine and Religion in Colonial Latin America. And the title of Hyland's presentation is Religion Rebranded, How Maya Religion Persisted with the Arrival and Increased Influence of Catholicism. And please, everyone, mute your microphones while Hyland is presenting, please. Okay, take it away, Hyland.
All right. Well, I hope it's sharing. Y'all have to let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Not yet, Hyland.
Not yet.
We see you.
Better? There we go. Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Looks great.
Awesome. One day I'll be able to work PowerPoint correctly. Okay. And so, as Dr. Sunder said, I'm Hyland Gonzalez, and this is my capstone presentation, Religion Rebranded, How Maya Religion Persisted with the Arrival and Increased Influence of Catholicism. And so before I get into my research question, I just wanted to talk about why I chose this topic. In the pre-req class, we read a book called 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall. And in the book, one of Restall's myths is that the military conquest of the New World also resulted in the cultural conquest of the New World, but he brings up that that is not the case, as indicated by the many indigenous people that still live today and speak their indigenous languages and practice their own religions. And so from looking at this, I came up with my research question: how and in what ways did my religion persist with the arrival of Catholicism and over time as the influence of Catholicism increased? And so from my research question, I developed my thesis and argument, which is, despite the general assumption in literature on the Spanish conquest that the military conquest of the New World also resulted in cultural conquest, I will argue that Maya religion persisted. Through evidence of surviving religious practices and documents, I will show how Maya religion endured because of resistance through Catholicism and practicing in secret. In many cases, this led to Maya religious syncretism, the combined practice of Maya and Catholic religions through merging worship. This allowed for the survival of Maya religious practices, even under the guise of adding Catholic practices and beliefs. And so from this, my historical background I want to get into is starting with the Maya. The Maya had been a civilization like the Aztecs and the Inca, but by the time of Spanish arrival, they had sort of fell apart. They were living in independent political sort of groups. But despite these differences politically, they all shared a common culture and they all practiced a polytheistic religion. And this religion emphasized cycles of rebirth and reciprocity, while also focusing on idol worship and both human and animal sacrifice. And so this is how the Spanish found them when they arrived, and sort of into the conquest. The military conquest of the Maya lasted for over 20 years in the Yucatan, in some places longer. But despite how long the military conquest lasted, the reconstruction of the Maya communities happened almost immediately. They moved them around so that they'd be easier to control and convert. The Franciscans, the first missionaries to reach the Maya and to come to Mexico in general, took advantage of this immediate reconstruction and grouping together these people to try to convert them easier. But this didn't necessarily work out, as resistance was almost immediate. There were cases found of continued idol worship and even human sacrifice. And the Franciscans retaliated against this harshly, often through severe punishments, and in worst cases, execution by hanging. And one of the main players in this was a friar by the name Diego de Landa. He was one of the first to minister to the Maya, but he was also one of the most severe in punishing them for not adhering to Catholic beliefs. And as a result of this, in 1562, after unearthing a lot of Mayan idols and religious documents, he found them all to be heretical, and he ordered them all to be burned. And while the exact numbers are disputed, it can be estimated that this resulted in about 80% of all pre-Columbian Mayan documents being destroyed, which is significant. It comes up later in my presentation. But from a researching perspective, this makes looking into pre-Columbian Maya somewhat difficult due to the lack of resources available. And so from my historical background, move into my historiography, the sources that helped me with my paper and presentation. I sort of broke them, like Lexi did, into historical and anthropological sources. These are the historical sources. They helped me a lot with the background and sort of overall information on the Maya. In the first book I want to emphasize is Ingrid Clendening's Ambivalent Conquests, Maya and Spaniard in Yucatan, 1517 to 1570. In this book, Clendening recounts the story of the Mayan conquest from both Maya and Spanish perspectives. She details the Franciscan effort to evangelize while also emphasizing the Maya resistance to Catholicism that happened at the same time. And this book contributed a lot to my background for both this presentation and the paper. And another source I want to highlight is J. Eric Thompson's The Rise and Fall of Maya Civilization. This is an older source. It was published in 1966, but at the time it was considered the most extensive work on Maya civilization at the time. And in this book on the subject of religion, Thompson points out that while the Maya did combine Christian practices with their own, that if you ask many of them in his time, the 60s, they can't really tell you which practice comes from which religion, which is a testament to how syncretic and combined they actually became by modern times. And then another book I want to emphasize is Mark C. Christensen's Nahua and Maya Catholicism, Texts and Religion in Colonial Central Mexico and Yucatan. This book is much more recent, from about 2011. In this book, Christensen details the journey in translating Catholic documents into Indigenous languages for the purposes of conversion, and the issues that came with translating and trying to communicate Catholic concepts to the Maya, who had a different worldview of how religion worked. And I'm going to detail some of these difficulties later in my presentation. And then the other sources I used for my secondary sources were anthropological. These often detailed either specific rituals or specific instances in a lot of syncretism, and a lot of these were much more modern. And the first article I want to highlight is John M. Watanabe's From Saints to Shibboleths, Image, Structure, and Identity in Maya Religious Syncretism. In this article, Watanabe focuses on religious syncretism within individual Mayan communities that exist recently, discussing their appropriation of Christian saints and how many communities turn them into indigenous people like themselves. For example, in the city he highlights, Santiago Chimaltenango in Guatemala, the Maya there identify their patron saint, Saint Simon, or Saint Santiago, as a Maya like themselves. They dress him as a traditional Mayan man would dress, and they communicate and pray to him in their dialect of Maya, Mam. Another document I want to highlight is Garrett Cook and Thomas Offit's Pluralism and Transculturalization in Indigenous Maya Religion. This document discusses rituals and processes of a specific Mayan town and highlights the practice of costumbre, which in this town, they use this term to describe their syncretic religion, their combining of Maya and Catholic beliefs, and I will get into the details of this later in my presentation. And so the primary sources I used, some of them. The first I want to highlight is the Popol Vuh, which is actually the Maya creation story. This is one of the few documents that is for sure from pre-Columbian times. It highlights the creations of the first humans while also discussing the cycles of reciprocity and rebirth that I mentioned earlier in my background. And this is actually helpful in my paper for setting up the background of Maya beliefs and helping with comparative things later in the paper. Another source I want to highlight is actually a book of travel accounts. It's Thomas Gage's Travels in the New World. Thomas Gage was an English friar and also a Dominican friar. And he spent time in colonial Latin America all throughout, and he also spent time with the Maya. And in the town he was in, he emphasized that the Maya there continued to use idols, despite having been converted to Christianity. But he also pointed out that the version of Christianity that they were practicing focused a lot on offerings to saints and giving alms to the church. And he attributes this to it being on the side of the priests, that the priests taught them to mostly focus on giving substantial offerings and alms because it would benefit the priests and the church could become rich. But it also must be noted that in other literature sources, they argue that the Maya pick and chose what suited them best to believe, and that the practices of Catholic doctrine they wanted to use. So while his view is important to look at, it must also be noted that this is disputed in other sources. And then a final source of primary documents I want to talk about are the Chilombalams. There are several of these. I used 3 in my paper, but they are compilations of syncretic documents produced by the Maya, and they document rituals, Mayan prophecies, histories, and sort of calendars. But their existence is a testament alone to the fact that the Maya took great care to practice in secret after colonialism or during and after colonialism. And they made a good point to try to keep these sources alive for their descendants to continue to use them and so that their culture didn't die. And so now some points of discussion I want to get into are that of conversion, inquisition, saint cults, some examples of post-colonial syncretism, and then some conclusions. The first one, the process of conversion, I kind of split it up into training of Indigenous members of the community to help with conversion, and then translations. For the first part of training, the Catholic priests, when they came in, made a point to train Indigenous men in the Catholic doctrine and how to do certain Catholic things to help with the process of conversion and to help minister in the community. In my communities, these were called maestros. They often took over things like daily mass and burials and baptisms when the priests were absent, which in the case of the Maya was often. The priests would sort of be there to set up and sort of guide the maestros, but then they would often leave for years at a time to go to larger cities. And a lot of the Mayas were spread out into smaller villages. So that would kind of leave the maestros up to religious instruction. And there was no really regulation of how Catholic that instruction became after the priests left. And this comes under the subject of translations. Often there would be mistranslations between Catholic doctrine and into the Indigenous languages. The example that came from Christensen's book was that the Catholic version might say to love the Christian God and only the Christian God, but my example would be to love the Christian God above all others. Not really emphasizing that you give up worshiping the Mayan gods, but you just have to make sure you emphasize your worship in him before you do the others. And so this kind of led to conceptual misunderstandings, such as that one, the moving away from polytheism to monotheism. And then this subject comes back around to the selective teaching that Gage documented in his travels in Guatemala, where even though they may assume that the Maya were picking up all these Catholic beliefs and becoming true Catholics, the priests may have emphasized some areas of Catholicism above others, while the Maya might also have been choosing to work with these areas above others. And so this goes into sort of the Inquisitions, because when they found Indigenous people to be sort of continuing to practice their own beliefs, they would torture and often execute them. But there has been evidence that Inquisitions were used as a weapon of resistance by the Indigenous people. As Zach mentioned earlier in his presentation, the priests would often take advantage of sort of women and sometimes even men and abuse them. And the Maya sort of made a point that if Christianity teaches, you're supposed to be monogamous or not have sex outside of marriage or be violent, then how can the priest continue to do this and it still be Christian? So it actually resulted in some priests being sort of demoted or sent away, which was sort of a relief to the Maya. And then another aspect of Inquisitions that becomes important is the resurfacing of religious works, because despite the initial just sort of getting rid of their pre-Columbian documents earlier, many of them would still resurface. So there would still be like pre-Columbian documents and then other ones that they created after in replacement of some that were destroyed that would still show up, which is a testament to their ability and desire to preserve their own culture. Then another aspect of colonial structure is that of saint cults or cofradias. They were a cult system centered around a specific saint, usually a patron saint of a city. These would be set up sort of like, in a way, a church would. There'd be an officer hierarchy. These people have like more important jobs. These would do like day-to-day tasks. And often these officer hierarchies were staffed with former Indigenous priests. And they would attend to certain things like daily mass, presiding over burials, taking care of the icons of the saints that they centered their worship around. But at the same time, a lot of these members of these saint cults continued to do animal sacrifice and practice their own beliefs on the side. And sort of this brings us into the present day and after colonialism. There are still many examples of syncretic religion that exist after colonialism and today. The older example I want to get into is that of the cult of the talking cross that came out of the caste war. The caste war was a mind war for independence that lasted from 1847 to 1901. And one of the leaders of the independence movement, Juan de la Cruz, received a vision of a talking cross, where Jesus, through this talking cross, spoke to him and told him how he could defeat the opposing armies. And this is an example of sort of syncretic religion, because while the Maya had idols that would speak and deliver messages to the priests, this came in the form of a cross and was the voice of Jesus. So it is a Christian adaptation of an already existing Maya belief. Another aspect of post-colonial religion is the costumbre that I mentioned earlier, the practitioners costumbristas. They believe in the Christian God and Jesus and worship Christian saints, but they also honor Mayan gods and continue to practice Mayan rituals at the same time. And they still use idols in their rituals. And many of these rituals often include both Catholic and Maya priests. or they would have the Mayan priests do a ritual to a certain god, while a Catholic priest would also do mass to honor the Christian god. And then another final example of these rituals that I specifically found in my literature was the kook ritual, which while in pre-Columbian times and in modern times, it was to promote fertile crops and economic prosperity. The pre-Columbian version required the mock hunt of a man dressed like a deer who would later be sacrificed. But in colonial times, this was adapted to a bullfight, which was a Spanish introduction to colonial Latin America. And the bull would be, they would perform a bullfight, sometimes even putting deer antlers on the bull, and the bull would later be sacrificed. So they adapted to the Spanish standards of no longer practicing human sacrifice by adding in a acceptable Spanish tradition. So they continue to do the ritual and it could have the same meaning, but just done so that it would be acceptable in Spanish culture. And so now for some conclusions. As exemplified earlier, my religion persists, as seen in the syncretic documents they produce and the syncretic practices they created. However, the fact that many cannot tell you what belief originates in what religion is a testament to the religious transformation that occurred. While there were many Mayan documents lost, and there were some Maya practices lost, and Catholic practices were introduced in. They may have lost some of their culture, but they managed to preserve it through combining it into a syncretic religion. In a way, their religion went through a sort of cycle of rebirth. These are my sources. Do we have any questions?
Woohoo! Hyland, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, questions for Hyland, everybody.
All right, I'll start if it's all right. Yeah, good job. I think the thing that connects this with my thinking is always going back to American slavery and the way they use religion and as a tool, for as oppression, but also how slaves used it as well for resistance. Can you talk a little bit more, I guess, about how you see this syncretism, like you said, selective teaching, those kinds of things, where this conversion to Catholicism actually becomes the language of resistance for these people, as opposed to necessarily being, you said, fully appropriated in another way?
Well, I guess to start, it was sort of, they would continue to be under the guise of Catholicism. They were like, oh yes, we're practicing Catholicism, but then in secret they would practice their own religion. And a way sort of to make it look more acceptable, like with the kook ritual, for example, they sort of added some Catholic and Spanish stuff in, so it looked more acceptable in Spanish culture. But they still kept a lot of their own religion in there. And the fact that they did is sort of a resistance in itself, because the Spanish came in wanting everyone to be just Catholic, and that was very much not the case.
Okay, good.
And Hyland, could you talk a little bit about why the Maya, you mentioned this a little bit, but just to give a little bit more detail, why is it that the Maya were so unique in this regard, that their specific practices continue, as opposed to the Aztecs and the Incas, which are much more difficult to discern in modern times?
Right. The way the Maya conquest went down, for one, they were already disconnected, unlike the Aztecs and the Inca, who sort of had a cultural center, they were already spread out, having become a fallen civilization. So they were not nearly as connected as the others were. So you may get to one, like the Yucatan, for example, the Maya there, you might get to them at one time, but it still took them years to get to some groups in other places.
Yeah. And
then on top of that, the Maya didn't really have as to the Spanish at least, as much valuable resources because they didn't have any sort of precious metals where they lived. It was very rocky and the terrain was not really desirable. Like there was some sort of like colonies there, like they did, obviously besides the priests come in, but that was much, much later because the farmland wasn't really viable. And it was a sort of just, they got to them at that point.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't as desirable, so they didn't feel the need to do as much there.
But it's really interesting because if you look at and compare the different ways that conquest took place, first and foremost, your presentation really highlights the way that conquest as a process, right? Not an event, and one that is inherently never finished. Right. And it completely goes against what we understand to be conquest, which is like it begins in this date and then it ends and everyone else is dead. I mean, it's just not the reality of what happens throughout the vast majority of the Americas. And your presentation in your paper does a really great job reminding us of that. Other questions for Hyland?
Hey, Hyland, Dr. Heiser. I got a quick question for you. Who were the agents carrying out this syncretistic blending? And in particular, I'm interested in the indigenous priests that you referenced in your presentation. Were these indigenous priests, for one thing, when did the church encourage indigenous priests to serve in that role? And secondly, were these indigenous priests already considered or recognized as religious figures and leaders in the indigenous religions before they became priests in the church?
Right. They already were considered sort of, as you said, important religious figures. Like not only was there the like sort of political figures, but on this other side, the religious figures that were super important. And then early on, when the Catholic priests came in, they were like, if we're going to start the conversion, we need to start top up and sort of get the indigenous priests on board. And so that's where some of that training came in, where they were like, okay, here is our language, here's our beliefs, and now go help us spread this within the community. So like they were already trusted figures and they were hoping that this would make conversion easier.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And what about and Hyland, I know we've talked about this, and I know Dr. Heiser is familiar with Clendenin's work because we've talked about it before. But the cool thing that she discovers, and what you talked about also in your paper, is what happens in just like in households, in like everyday Mayan households, and the way that people are like hiding. I mean, what do they do? You know, what are they hiding specifically?
Oftentimes it was not only sometimes the documents, but also idols. So like there were two kinds of idols, the large idols that were in temples, but also small household idols.
Exactly.
And then the one specific example I remember, they had like all their Christian iconography up, but then like immediately behind that would be their own idols, the Mayan idols. And they would sort of kind of hide them, not in plain sight, but just kind of right there, still close.
Absolutely. And it's just it's remarkable what we've been able to find on the household level among the Mayan peoples, in light of the fact that, as you say, somewhere around 80% of all Mayan documentation was burnt, right, by Diego de Landa and others. So it's pretty incredible the work that historians, archaeologists, anthropologists are managing to do to resuscitate this history. And they're doing it right now with all this new laser technology, and they're discovering all these new, Mayan towns, and they're discovering that the Maya were much more urbanized than we previously thought. So this is really an exciting field of history right now.
It is very much so.
Could I ask another question?
Yes, sir.
The process of this syncretism, is it a process that the Catholic Church was sort of like wink, wink, look away, we're not seeing this, as long as they're calling themselves Catholics, let's just, okay, fine, good enough? Or was the church bothered by this? And are these Mayans, for instance, going after central doctrines of the Christian faith, or are they playing around on the edges and the church is willing to say, okay, good enough? That's close enough.
Early on, they were very much more strict with like what they would allow people to get away with. Like early on is when you had the severe inquisitions, like the Diego de Landas and others, where they would torture people that they found to be practicing idol worship. Mm-hmm. But over time, this sort of relaxed, and they would allow some people to get away with some stuff. And then sort of, and in like Thomas Gage's community, his writings were from like the 1700s. So it was sort of removed from the conquest, but still colonial times. And the priests there had sort of relaxed what they were focusing on. And then, of course, the indigenous people were sort of like, this is what we want to focus on because this fits best into what we're trying to do with our religion.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other last questions for Hyland? All right. Well, thank you so much, Hyland. That was fantastic and super interesting. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So now we are moving on to Jahnnie Connor, who is going to talk to us about a Republic of Missions, the reality of Jesuit missions among the Guarani tribe of Brazil and Paraguay. And it is a shame, unfortunately, that we're not presenting live today because our very own Dr. Safi is an expert on the subject, and Jahnnie has spoken with her and used her scholarship, so we're missing out on that. But Jahnnie, why don't you tell us about your presentation?
Alrighty. Okay, I'm tired. I'm trying to share my screen. Oops. Can y'all see it?
Nope, we just see you right now. Oh.
Yes.
There we go. Yay!
Nope. Okay. All right, so like Dr. Sumner said, my capstone title is A Republic of Missions, the Reality of Jesuit Missions Among the Guarani Tribe of Brazil and Paraguay. So just for an overview of this capstone, first I want to address my research question, my thesis, my historical background, my historiography, the impact of missions, resistance, and the Jesuit expulsion, conclusion, and a brief bibliography. So before I jump into my research question, I do want to state why I chose to do my capstone on this topic. So in our prereq class, the Colonial Latin America, we watched a movie called The Mission, which is essentially what I'm basing my capstone around. But I found that it was a typical Hollywood movie and there's a lot of inaccuracies. Also, the historical context was correct. So basically, my capstone is about debunking the movie The Mission. And that leads me to my research question. How did the Jesuit missions impact the Guarani tribe of Brazil and Paraguay, and what components of the missions made them successful? And I argue that despite the colonizers of Spain and Portugal enslaved the Guarani of Brazil and Paraguay, they did not influence the Guarani culturally to the degree of the Jesuit missions. The Jesuit missions left an impact through religious conversion, economic systems, and lasting architecture among the Guarani tribe that is still present in modern times. In spite of the Jesuits, oh my gosh, okay, I'm sorry. In spite of the Jesuits believing that the missions were God's divine plan, the Jesuits demolished the Guarani culture and prevented it from being restored to its former state. So for a little bit of historical background, first I want to begin with the Guarani tribe. The tribe is predominantly seen throughout modern-day Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia. In some parts of Uruguay, there are also clusters of the Guarani stretching to the Andes Mountains in Peru. The tribe was self-sufficient, but not considered a civilization like the Aztecs or Incas. The main ruling forces of the tribe were shamans and chiefs. However, the chiefs only ruled during war times. The tribes did practice polygamy and warfare cannibalism. The Guarani would often eat their war hostages as a way to send a message to their enemy. The tribe were hunter-gatherers and semi-sedentary. They were nomadic during non-growing seasons, so since the tribe was mainly agriculturally based, they would move around to find better land. One of my favorite things about the Guarani was the religion. It was a very complex polytheistic religion, and they believed in a land similar to the heaven, called the land without evil. And in the land without evil, they believed crops would grow on their own and people could dance their lives away and they would not have to worry about anything. And as the European colonists came to South America, the Guarani were forced into a forced labor system called the encomienda, and when the Jesuits came, they sought to end this. So for a little bit of background on the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus was created in 1540 to combat Protestantism during the Counter-Reformation. It was founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540 at the University of Paris. The Catholic Church wanted indigenous converts so the church could have dominance over Protestantism because they believe if we have more members than you, then we're obviously the most dominant religious force on the earth. And from there, they entered Brazil in 1550 to kind of dip their toes in and establish the first settlement to see how things would go. And from there, they entered Paraguay from Brazil in 1588. The first tribe they did try to convert was a distant relative of the Guarani. They were called the Guarani tribe, but this failed because the Guarani tribe did fight back. And then from there, they moved on to the Guarani. And just to talk about my historiography, I want to highlight three main sources that were the most helpful to me. And the first source is The Lost Cities of Paraguay, The Art and Architecture of the Jesuit Reductions from 1607 to 1787 by C.J. Manaspi and Jose Maria Blanch. The Lost Cities depict the ruins of Jesuit architecture and statues of varying forms of Jesus. This book also provides concise maps of where the architecture is in Paraguay and the layout of a typical mission site. And for my next source, it is The Spiritual Conquest, Early Years of the Jesuit Missions in Paraguay by Antonio Rudes de Montoya, translated by Dr. Safi and Barbara Ganson. Antonio Rudes de Montoya was one of the most notable Jesuits, and he was a Jesuit during the Paraguay missions. His account provides insight into the encounters between the Jesuits, settlers, and native people, and it also explores the Jesuits' goal to end the Indian slavery because this was against Jesuit beliefs. And it also explores how everyday life was in the missions, like religion, hunting, farming, etc. And for my last primary source, I do want to highlight, it is called The History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil, otherwise called America, by Jean de Lery. Jean de Lery was a French voyager who explored Brazil before the Jesuits ever came. He wrote his personal account on everything imaginable about Brazil. He extensively covered the Guarani tribe and a plethora of topics such as religion, architecture, how they gather food, etc. And one thing I found interesting is that he tried to explain Christianity to them and get them to catch on, but the language barrier was too difficult. And to go into some of my secondary sources, the first one I want to address is The Black Rose in Paraguay. The Success of the Guarani Missions Hastened the Abolition of the Jesuit by William E. Jahnnie. This book examines the success of the Jesuit missions in Paraguay and how that success added to the Jesuit expulsion. This book was especially helpful because it was one of the only books that I found in my research that actually blamed the Jesuit expulsion on the success of the missions. And for my next source, it is The Guarani Under Spanish Rule in the Rio de la Plata by Barbara Ganson. And this book provides an ethnographic perspective, and it uses death rates and birth rates. Ganson provides a unique perspective as she believes that the Guarani played a part in their own faith. And my last secondary source is Regional Conflict and Demographic Patterns on the Jesuit Missionaries Among the Guarani in the 7th and 18th centuries by Robert H. Jackson. He discusses how conflict, like militia conflict from other tribes in the area, played in with demographic effects and how it affected the Jesuit missions. And my voice in this is, I believe that the missions were a systematic institution, and the Jesuits left an impact so great that the Eurocentric life is still seen today in Paraguay and Brazil. All right, so just some background information on the Jesuit missions. The missions took place in the 17th and early 18th centuries. The majority of the missions took place in Paraguay and Brazil, and a little bit into Argentina, as you can see on this map in the lower right corner. The missions were approved by European officials, such as the King of Portugal and the main Bishop of Spain. The Jesuits had complete autonomy, so that means they could do whatever they want as long as they provided revenue to the crown. The missions sought to end slavery and convert the native people. The Jesuits held power in every facet. The Guarani really had no official power, and the missions were set up socially and politically to ensure that the Jesuits had complete power and the Guarani had none. One interesting thing is that the locations were secluded to prevent raids, because in the early missions, they were near rivers, and it made it easier for pirates to come, such as the Paulistas, who would come and burn down the missions and take the Guarani to sell them into slavery, and this would destroy all of the hard work that the Jesuits had done. Right. So for my first point of my argument that I want to address is conversion, and this was the main and largest goal, and it had the largest impact on the Guarani. The conversion happened over time and not all at once. It did take a while for the Guarani to accept the trust of the Jesuits, and vice versa. And the Jesuits gained trust by learning the language, which is very difficult, but it actually is one of the official languages of Paraguay, which is very sweet. And one way the Jesuits used to implement Christianity was by the workday. So for the first half of the day, it would be working, while the other half would be spent in church. And they went to Mass every single day. And the Jesuits used communion as a reward for the Guarani if they participated in church. Another reason why they were able to gain and convert the Guarani so successfully was by eliminating the power of the shaman. And as I stated previously, the shaman had the main control over the Guarani and the Guarani tribe hierarchy. The shamans were not happy with the Guarani, I'm sorry, my hand hit my mouse pad, converting to Christianity, and this elimination of power would allow for the Jesuits to have complete control of the Guarani in every facet. As conversion progressed, the Guarani referred to the Christian goddess Tupa. In the Guarani religion, the main god's name was Tupa. So this just kind of shows how the Guarani were implementing their own religion with the Eurocentric religion that the Jesuits brought to them. So for my next point that I want to address is European architecture, and the Jesuits introduced a style called the Cusqueña Baroque style, known as the Mestizo style, and the architecture always portrayed Catholic vigils, as you see on the pictures on the side, and it always had symbols of Jesus and the Mother Mary, along with the crest of the Society of Jesus as a kind of, a way to remind them of who's in control. The Jesuits did use indigenous labor to build the churches, and the Guarani did receive a small wage, and the dominant architecture showed that the lack of indigenous religion that the Jesuits worked so hard to eliminate, and how the Jesuits used space to demonstrate power over the Guarani. And for my third point of impact I want to talk about is demographic. So at the highest peak of the missions, the population was 30,000. And as you see on the side, here is the population of the most populous mission throughout the history of them. There were 5 smallpox epidemics that killed thousands of Guarani at a time. And even though there was a high mortality rate, there were still famines, and the Guarani often fled. And during times of famine and disease, the Guarani would fled but would come back later after searching for food. And this fight or flight response showed that the Guarani were dependent on the missions for food and protection and shelter. And for my last point of impact that I want to talk about is cultural. The largest impact was seen in family life. The Jesuits promoted a Catholic lifestyle, of course, and that meant practicing monogamy. And this was such a problem for the Jesuits that they even had to consult the current Pope at the time on how to combat polygamy. The Guarani were taught skills like blacksmithing, instrument making, weaving, etc. Instrument making was seen as one of the most desirable skills, and the Jesuits believed that if the Guarani participated in music and mass, that they would connect better with the religion and God. The Jesuits did introduce a system of communal and individual land plots. So the individual land plots were for the Guarani, for their own families, but the communal land plots would serve for the whole missions. So for 3 days a week, the Guarani would work on their own individual land plots, and for the rest of the week, they would work on their communal land plots. However, the Jesuits did try to introduce advanced farming, but the Guarani preferred to use their own bone tools. And the Guarani were selective when integrating culture that the Jesuits introduced, giving them some agency, but they were very accepting of Christianity, surprisingly. And I think that's because there was a similar link between the land without evil and the Christian heaven. So I want to address resistance and the Jesuit expulsion. So in 1750, the two kingdoms of Spain and Portugal came up with the Treaty of Madrid, and it meant that 7 Jesuit missions would have to split up and move across the Uruguay River in the Rio de la Plata region. The treaty meant to bring peace in the Rio de la Plata region because Spain and Portugal were fighting over a port that was a major moneymaker for both Spain and Portugal. The Guarani were not happy because they were fine with being citizens of Spain, and they did not want to move away from their homes because that's all they knew. This led to an uprising known as the Guarani War, and it was very short. The Jesuits even fought alongside of the Guarani because they did not want all their hard work to go to waste, but eventually they lost, and Spain and Portugal took over, and the missions moved across the Uruguay River. The outcome of the Guarani War and the Bourbon Reforms led to the Jesuit expulsion in 1767. The Bourbon Reforms were a series of legislation meant to modernize Spain, and the Jesuits were on top of the list to be booted out because they believed that the Jesuits were starting to gain too much power in the area. After the expulsion, the Guarani fled the abandoned mission sites, and they migrated to the Rio de la Plata region in search for better economic opportunities. The results show that the Guarani had become dependent on the missions in every aspect of life. So moving on to my conclusion, I believe that the Jesuits cheated the Guarani of knowing their true culture, not the whitewashed syncretic version. The Jesuit missions were more than an evangelical campaign. It was a mass cultural conversion. Despite having the autonomy from the crown, the Jesuits created their own version of Catholic domination. The Guarani adapted to the Jesuit way of life and to their own to create a blend of European and Indigenous culture. The Western point of view argues that native tribes are better for being colonized because they become more advanced and they learn ways to better themselves. However, we do not understand that the descendants of colonial Guarani will never know their true culture. And that's my bibliography, and this is just some of the secondary and primary sources that I used in my capstone, but this is not all of them. Right. So any questions?
Yay!
Let me figure out how to do this.
Great job, Jahnnie.
How do I get out of this? Oh. Okay.
All right, everyone. Questions for Jahnnie?
Oh, wow, my throat's so dry.
Jahnnie, I have a question for you.
Oh, Ellie Porter.
This may be outside the scope of your research, but when you were talking about like your background section, I was just wondering if you knew of like why the Guarani tribe did not, like, I guess, feel the presence of the Jesuits as much as the Guarani did, or like what made them so resistant to it.
That's one thing that is a little bit out of my realm, but I thought about that myself because the Guarani they're more accepting at first. But I think it's because if they actually learned the language of the Guarani, and as them being a distant cousin of the Guarani, I think maybe there was the language barrier because there is like the Tupi Guarani, the Guarani language it's different for each tribe. So I think that may be a reason, but also the Guarani tribe is more violent than.
Thank you. You did so good.
That's a great question, Ellie. I don't know the answer to that. Where's Dr. Safi when we need her, you know? More than likely, I bet you're right, Jahnnie. I mean, I think that's probably a good guess, is that language has something to do with it, and probably geography, you know?
Yes, most definitely, because
Yeah.
the missions, like where the Guarani were, it was more like of a mountainous region, but it was still a longer river, and that kind of screwed them up when they moved into the mountains to get away from.
Also, I still love how this entire project was motivated basically by a hatred of the movie The Mission. So I think that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, other questions for Jahnnie?
Jahnnie, do you
Yes.
Wait, Rick, we can't hear you. Can you hear Rick? I can't hear him.
No, I can't hear Dr. Heiser.
Rick?
Yeah, it would help if I unmuted, perhaps.
Oh, there we go. Hey, Dr. Heiser. Okay.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Don't laugh at me, Harris. Sorry about that. Jahnnie, was the Jesuits approach a deliberate strategy? Did they go in there with the idea that we are going to obliterate this pagan culture and replace it with a Christian culture? Or was it just the result of time and living together and those sorts of things?
I think a bit of both, because I know when the mission was formed, the Catholic Church found out that the Franciscans did enter the South America area before the Jesuits ever came, and that didn't go so very well. So the Catholic Church believed, they didn't do well, so we can. But I don't think they meant to destroy the culture that the Guarani had, and I think over time, I don't think they expected it to go that well, but it did. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
Well, certainly there were certain aspects of the culture that they 100% wanted to destroy, like polygamy,
Of
right?
course.
I mean,
like
that had to go.
That's not good with God.
Now, on that topic, actually, Jahnnie, that just reminded me. I had a question about that. What was the you talked about it, but I don't remember you saying how they did it and what they did to eliminate that particular practice.
The Jesuits eliminating that practice.
Yeah.
It was more of a kind of like a slap on the wrist, and they wouldn't get fed, or maybe they wouldn't, because the Guarani did get a small allowance, but they weren't, like they didn't kill them or anything, or sometimes lashings depending on it, but I didn't really find much of that in my research. Just how horrified they were at the idea of cannibalism.
Well, what did the Pope say about polygamy? What did he tell them to do?
They have to rule over marriages. They have to ingrain it, starting from the younger generations, that monogamy is the right way and not polygamy. And they would get punished again with either without food, or if they slept with multiple people, then lashings.
Okay. Yeah.
What is your understanding of this, Dr. Heiser?
Of polygamy?
I mean, of the Pope's, like the way in which the Pope.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that the church's practice has often been to kind of going back to Hyland's presentation, to tolerate certain cultural practices that could be Christianized and turned into something that was tolerable. Okay. And so that's one of the things that was going through my mind is
I see what you're saying.
Is that, if you go into a Mayan house and you see idols, I'm not sure what you're getting all worked up over when you go into a Catholic church and you see what looks an awful lot like these objects. And so, but there were things like polygamy that would have been considered, that's just not a point of compromise.
Non-starter. Yeah.
That's just a non-starter.
Yeah.
And that's a basic Christian principle that you didn't give on.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. I have one more question for Jahnnie.
Okay.
Jahnnie, did the Jesuits provide military protection to these people?
They wanted to at first, but Spain and Portugal and Catholic officials, they did not. But when it started, when like militias would come through and pirates would come through, they would let the Guarani make their own tools, but when it came to the Guarani War, somehow the Guarani were supplied with military weapons.
Okay, thank you.
Jahnnie, I have another question for you, but it's not so much a question, but just something that we talked about over the course of your research, which that, and Jahnnie's paper talks more about this, but the Jesuits' use of space and architecture as a way to assert their dominance and their authority among the Guarani. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I found it to be one of the most fascinating parts of your research.
Okay. Well, I know like architecture was a big thing, and I think that it stands for itself because it's the ruins are still there, especially in Argentina, and the use of like these ornate churches, like the Franciscans when they came through, they had built smaller cathedrals, and these beautiful ornate cathedrals that the Jesuits built were kind of like a way to stomp over the Franciscans' attempt of converting the Guarani. So it's just kind of like a big, we're more dominant than you kind of thing.
But it's interesting because I think that not enough people consider, at least especially when studying the history of Indigenous peoples, right? I mean, certainly architecture plays a really important role in like Eurocentric kinds of history, but when we talk about Indigenous history, we have to remember how important it was. And again, this process that takes place also to space, right? Changes to space that take place can really help us, not just as historians, right? Really important sources that we have to analyze cultural and historical change. So I thought that was really great that you did that, Jahnnie.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions for Jahnnie? Anybody else? Anybody? Okay, well, thank you so much, Jahnnie. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right, guys, we're going to start our last panel. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will start our last panel of the day. Yay!
Hey, Jahnnie.
Hey.
Do you think I should go ahead and present my screen? If I go ahead and pull my screen up, will you tell me if it's up?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it?
Wait, give me a second.
Is it now?
Yes, it says you're presenting.
Okay, and then does it look like I'm reading off my notes?
Wait, let me. I can't. Wait, let me get to your. No, it doesn't look like it. Wait, pretend like you're reading.
Huh?
Pretend like you're reading.
Okay, thank you. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Here.
All right, you're good.
Okay, thank you.
Ellie, you nervous?
Yes.
You're gonna be fine.
You got this.
Wait, can y'all see me or do y'all just see my screen?
I can see you.
I can see you and your screen.
I might turn my camera off when I'm doing mine. And just have my slides up there.
This is scary.
You got this. And we'll be over soon.
So like the people that are watching us,
I can't even see who's watching.
that's what I was about to say. Like, how do we know who's watching us or who's not?
You don't, which I kind of
Tell
like.
you.
Well, yeah, that is true. I feel like everybody be laughing at me.
No,
Yeah, but
it'll be good. It'll be good.
believe me, yours is definitely better than mine.
Thomas, if you don't end with "Are there any questions?" I'm leaving.
With the bird.
You should. I swear, you should put an eye patch on.
I'll be like this the whole time.
You should. You should be like, surrender the booty.
Ellie said, never mind.
It's
Oh, don't worry. I already heard it.
Somebody's gonna ask me like a hard question. I'm gonna be like,
Thomas, I want you to know that one of Harrison's favorite books in the whole world is about baby pirates, and I think of you every time we read it.
oh, perfect.
I know.
That's funny.
I wish that I could see y'all.
Why can't you see us?
Well, because my screen is shared or whatever, so I can't see like y'all.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I know. It's weird because you feel like you're just talking to yourself. You're like, no.
I know, and my like grandma's here, and she's so confused. She's like, "Who are you talking to?" Like, she has no idea.
Poor grandma.
Yeah, she doesn't even own a computer.
Does anyone know? Is anyone like watching the live stream? I'm just curious to know if it's working.
It's working. I've had
Oh,
people
good.
texting me.
Some
about
people
Oh,
it.
good. Okay. Oh, good. Awesome. Okay, good. I'm so happy to hear that. All right, everybody. Well, we are going to start now. Hold on one second. I am going to stop recording.